Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvein. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I know this story might sound unbelievable to some people, and honestly, if I had only heard it from someone else, I probably would have questioned parts of it too. But everything I'm about to share happened to me personally, and it's the reason I completely stopped searching for paranormal experiences. For most of my life, I was fascinated by ghosts, spirits, and unexplained events. I was the type of person who would watch documentaries, read stories online, and spend hours researching strange encounters. I always believed there were things in this world that science couldn't fully explain. Looking back now, I wish I had left my curiosity alone. The events that changed everything happened several years ago when I was living with my wife, my sister-in-law, and my young son. We all shared the same house, and for the most part, life was normal. It wasn't a particularly old house, and there was nothing about it that seemed unusual when we first moved in. However, strange things had been happening there long before I ever bought an Ouija board. At first, the incidents were minor, small enough that we could easily brush them off as coincidences or tricks of the mind. We would occasionally hear footsteps when nobody was walking around. Sometimes we'd hear sounds coming from another room and discover nothing there. Other times, objects would seem slightly out of place, but nothing dramatic enough to make us panic. We joked about it more than anything. Then there was an incident involving my son that has stayed with me ever since. At the time, he was still very young. He hadn't really started talking yet and mostly communicated by pointing and reaching toward things he wanted. One afternoon, I was in the laundry area when I noticed him walk into the bathroom nearby. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I saw him stop in the corner near the washing machine. There was nothing there. No toy. No person. Nothing. Yet he stood there staring into the corner with complete focus. Then he slowly lifted his arms upward as if he wanted someone to pick him up. I remember watching him for several seconds, waiting for him to lose interest. Instead, he kept reaching. It looked exactly like he was trying to be picked up by somebody standing in that corner. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Children have active imaginations, but there was something about the way he was acting that felt wrong. I quickly picked him up and carried him out of the room. Even then, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he saw a shadow. Maybe he was reaching for something I couldn't see. Maybe it meant absolutely nothing. At that point, I wasn't particularly worried. What I didn't realize was that things were about to become much stranger. Around that time, my interest in the paranormal was growing stronger. I spent countless hours reading stories online about haunted houses, spirit communication, and unexplained encounters. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I bought an Ouija board. At the time, I didn't see it as dangerous. I viewed it as a harmless game, something interesting to experiment with. I knew there were people who believed it could contact spirits, but I approached it with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. The first few sessions seemed uneventful. Then things started happening. Whenever I used the board, the same name kept appearing. Dell. Every time. No matter when I used it, the answers always seemed to come from someone identifying themselves as Dell. At first, I assumed it was random. But after multiple sessions, my curiosity grew. Who was Dell? Why did the same name keep appearing? Eventually, I decided to do some research. I searched through public death records in my state, not expecting to find anything meaningful. To my surprise, I found a girl named Delcy Ray. She had died in a car accident in the same county where I lived. The discovery immediately caught my attention. The more information I gathered, the stranger things became. The details I had supposedly received through the board seemed to match information about the girl. Not every detail was exact. For example, the spirit claimed to be 6 years old, while records showed the girl was 9 when she died. But even that discrepancy seemed explainable at the time. A 6 and a 9 can look similar, depending on perspective. I convinced myself there might be some connection. As I sit here recalling this story, I still remember how obsessed I became with finding answers. The more interested I became, the more active the strange events in the house seemed to become. At least that's how it felt. Objects would disappear and reappear in different locations. Items that should have remained exactly where we left them would somehow end up across the room. At first, we blamed each other. Someone must have moved it. Someone must have forgotten where they put it. But eventually, certain incidents became harder to explain. One day, I left an object sitting on a table and walked into another room for only a few minutes. When I returned, it was gone. After searching the house, I found it in a completely different area. Again, there was probably a logical explanation. But when enough of these things happen, they begin to affect your thinking. You start paying attention to every unusual detail. You start questioning things you normally wouldn't question. The event involving the chair on our front porch was one of the first incidents that truly disturbed me. We had a small chair outside for my son. Normally, it sat against the house facing toward the road. It remained in that exact position most of the time. Occasionally, I would come home from work and notice that the chair had somehow been turned around. Instead of facing the road, it would be facing our front door. At first, I didn't care. My in-laws visited frequently and often stopped by throughout the week. I simply assumed one of them had moved it. Whenever I noticed it facing the door, I would turn it back and move on with my day. This happened several times. Eventually, I stopped paying attention to it altogether. Then, one afternoon, something happened that changed my perspective completely. It was just me and my sister-in-law at home. Nobody else was around. I had arrived home about 30 minutes earlier and distinctly remembered seeing the chair in its normal position. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I was walking through the living room toward the hallway when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like something scraping or shifting on the porch. The sound immediately caught my attention. The window was only a few feet away, so I looked outside. I didn't see anyone. No visitors, no neighbors, nothing. Thinking someone might have been approaching the house, I quickly walked to the front door. The moment I opened it, my stomach dropped. The chair had moved. Not only had it moved, but it was now positioned directly facing the front door. I froze. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. The placement felt deliberate, almost intentional. I immediately called for my sister-in-law. She came into the hallway and looked outside. The second she saw the chair, her expression changed. She became visibly nervous. What made the situation even stranger was that she had no idea about the previous incidents. I had never mentioned how often I found the chair turned around. When I explained everything afterward, she became even more unsettled. Neither of us could explain how it had happened. Still, as disturbing as that experience was, it wasn't the event that finally pushed me over the edge. That came later. Much later. Around this time, we had purchased a pet pig. It might sound strange, but part of the reason we got the pig was because we were looking for logical explanations for all the odd things happening around the house. If we heard noises, maybe it was the pig. If something moved, maybe the pig bumped into it. Having an animal around helped us feel less anxious, or at least it did for a while. One evening, everyone left the house except me. My wife was gone. My sister-in-law was gone. My son was elsewhere. The pig and I were the only living things inside the house. Honestly, I was looking forward to having the place to myself. I planned to spend the night gaming online with friends. The baby gates were set up across the entrances of the living room to keep the pig from wandering through the entire house. Everything felt normal. For hours, I sat there playing games, laughing with friends through my headset, and enjoying a rare quiet evening. Then I got that feeling. The feeling that someone is watching you. Most people know exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes you're alone, but suddenly every instinct tells you that you're not. At first, I ignored it. Then it grew stronger. I couldn't focus on the game anymore. Something felt wrong. Very slowly, I turned around. What I saw remains the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Standing near the doorway was a girl. She wasn't transparent. She wasn't glowing. She looked solid. Her skin was unnaturally pale. Long black hair hung around her face. But it was her eyes that horrified me. They were completely black. Not dark brown. Not shadowed. Black, as if there was nothing inside them. She was peeking around the doorway. One hand reached toward the baby gate. For a brief moment, we seemed to be looking directly at each other. Time stopped. Every muscle in my body locked up. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. Then, without warning, she moved. The figure instantly darted backward around the doorway and disappeared from sight. It happened so quickly that I barely had time to react. A surge of panic exploded through me. I screamed at the top of my lungs. The scream was so loud that my friends immediately started shouting through my headset. They thought someone had broken into my house. They thought I was being attacked. I could barely speak. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I remember yelling for one of my friends to come over immediately. I didn't care how crazy I sounded. I didn't care whether anyone believed me. I just didn't want to be alone anymore. After that, I backed myself into a position where I could see both entrances to the living room. I stayed there watching, waiting, listening. Every second felt like an hour. I refused to take my eyes off those doorways. Part of me expected the girl to appear again at any moment. I sat there completely frozen until my friend arrived. Only then did I finally feel safe enough to move. The next day, we decided we had reached our limit. Whatever was happening in that house, we wanted it to stop. We cleansed the house and tried to remove the negative energy that seemed to linger there. Whether it worked because of belief, coincidence, or something else entirely, I don't know. What I do know is that after that, the activity gradually stopped. The atmosphere in the house changed. The strange incidents became less frequent. Eventually, they disappeared altogether. To this day, I still don't know what happened. Maybe there are logical explanations for every event. Maybe stress, coincidence, and imagination played larger roles than I realize. Or maybe there was something else at work. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that those experiences completely changed my relationship with the paranormal. Before then, I actively searched for unexplained encounters. I wanted proof. I wanted experiences. I wanted answers. Afterward, I wanted the exact opposite. Some doors are better left closed. Some questions don't need answers. And some experiences stay with you forever. People often ask why I stopped investigating paranormal stories and experimenting with spirit communication. The answer is simple. Because once I felt like something might actually be looking back, the curiosity disappeared. All that remained was fear. Even now, years later, I can still picture that pale face peeking around the doorway. I can still remember those dark eyes. And I can still remember the overwhelming feeling that whatever I saw that night was something I never wanted to see again. That was the moment I stopped seeking the paranormal. And I have never looked back. When I was a kid, I was the definition of a scaredy cat. I hated the dark, always slept with my bedroom door open, and usually needed some kind of light on to feel comfortable enough to fall asleep. Looking back now, I know most children are afraid of things that go bump in the night, but my fear always seemed stronger than everyone else's. Even the smallest noises could keep me awake for hours. One thing I always remember from my childhood was how often my mom got sick. Whenever she caught a cold, the flu, or any kind of illness, it seemed to hit her much harder than it did other people. She had a weak immune system, so what might have been a minor sickness for someone else could leave her bedridden for weeks. Seeing her sick so often made me worry about her constantly, and she was always the person I ran to whenever I felt scared. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, something happened that stayed with me for years. One night, I went to bed like normal. Everything seemed fine. I fell asleep without any problems, but sometime in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up. The room was quiet, and nothing looked out of place, yet I felt incredibly uneasy. It was the strange feeling that someone was watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was just tired, and that my imagination was running wild. After a few minutes, I managed to calm myself down and eventually fell back asleep. The next night, the exact same thing happened. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night with that same uncomfortable feeling. It felt like someone was standing in the room watching me from the darkness. This time, however, I noticed something different. My closet door was slightly open. I clearly remembered shutting it before going to bed. Seeing that small crack in the door immediately made my heart start racing. I jumped out of bed and ran straight to my mom's room. She woke up and listened while I explained everything. Like most parents, she tried to reassure me. She told me that maybe I hadn't closed the closet door completely. She suggested the house settling during the night could have caused it to drift open slightly. Her explanation made sense, and eventually I felt a little better. I ended up sleeping in her room for the rest of the night. The following evening, my mom encouraged me to sleep in my own room again. I didn't want to, but she assured me everything would be fine. At some point during the night, I woke up again. This time, I heard a noise coming from inside the closet. At first, I thought it was one of my toys. Several of my toys had pre-recorded voice lines that would play when you pressed a button. The sound I heard seemed similar to that. But something wasn't right. The voices sounded distorted, slow, almost broken. My first thought was that the batteries might be dying. Then I remembered something important. Those toys only spoke when someone pressed the button. Nobody was pressing anything. I sat there staring at the closet while the strange sounds continued. Fear completely took over. I started crying. A few minutes later, my mom rushed into my room after hearing me. When she asked what was wrong, I explained that something was making my toys talk. She checked everything and found nothing unusual. Eventually, she calmed me down and told me it was probably a bad dream. That night, I slept in her room again. Over the next several days, I continued sleeping there because I was too scared to return to my own room. Eventually, though, my mom insisted that I start sleeping in my room again. The night I finally went back, I was determined to stay awake. I didn't want to be caught off guard. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. For hours, nothing did. Slowly, exhaustion began to win. My eyelids grew heavier and heavier. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it. the slow creak of my closet door opening. Every muscle in my body instantly tensed. The room suddenly felt colder. Not slightly colder. Freezing. The kind of cold that makes your skin prickle. I stared toward the closet. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then, I noticed them. Two eyes, staring back at me. I froze. My heart felt like it had stopped. The eyes remained perfectly still, watching me from the darkness inside the closet. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember thinking. I only remember the overwhelming fear. Then, I screamed, louder than I had ever screamed before. Within seconds, my mom rushed into the room. She immediately asked what was wrong. Still shaking, I pointed toward the closet. I told her someone was inside. Without hesitation, she walked over and opened the door completely. Nothing was there. The closet was empty. Every toy remained exactly where it should have been. The eyes were gone. Despite that, I knew what I had seen. At least, I believed I did. That night, I went back to sleeping in my mom's room. I stayed there for nearly 2 weeks. Eventually, I convinced myself that whatever had happened was over. I felt ready to sleep in my own room again. For a little while, everything seemed normal. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. The voices were quiet, barely audible. But I could hear them. One phrase stood out clearly. "She'll never find out about us." The moment I heard those words, my blood ran cold. Then I heard movement inside the closet. At first, it sounded like something shifting. Then the entire closet seemed to shake. The noise grew louder and louder. It sounded as though everything inside was rattling violently. For a moment, it reminded me of an earthquake. The shaking continued. Then, suddenly stopped. Silence filled the room. A second later, my nightlight switched off. The room was plunged into complete darkness. I sat frozen in bed. Then came the sound I had grown to fear more than anything else. The slow creak of the closet door opening. Again, I could see the eyes. This time, they weren't standing still. They were moving, slowly getting closer, closer, and closer. The room grew colder with every second. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But fear had locked me in place. Then I heard another sound. My mom's bedroom door opening. Relief flooded through me instantly. Moments later, she entered my room. The second she stepped inside, everything changed. The eyes disappeared. The feeling vanished. The room seemed normal again. What happened next is something that has always stayed with me. My mom immediately looked around and said, "Why is it so cold in here?" Then she noticed the nightlight. "Why is your nightlight off? You never sleep with it off." I told her that whatever had been in the room had turned it off. I told her it wanted to hurt me. After that night, I refused to sleep in my room again. Eventually, my mom decided to contact a priest. She explained everything that had been happening. After listening, the priest told us that what I was experiencing could be a negative spiritual presence. A few days later, he visited our home. He walked through the house, prayed, and blessed each room. From that point forward, things became quiet. The whispers stopped. The shaking stopped. The eyes never appeared again. For a long time, I believed everything was finally over. Then my mom told me something that terrified me even more. A few days before the priest arrived, she had experienced something herself. According to her, she woke up one night unable to breathe properly. The room felt freezing cold. As she struggled to move, she saw a dark figure hovering over her bed. She said it looked similar to what I had described. The experience left her feeling weak and exhausted afterward. Hearing that frightened me more than anything else, because until then, I thought I was the only one seeing strange things. Years have passed since those events. The terrifying eyes, the whispers, and the shaking closet. never returned after the blessing. However, I can't say I've stopped experiencing unusual things entirely. Every now and then, I still notice things I can't explain. The difference is that these experiences don't feel threatening. They don't scare me the way those childhood encounters did. If anything, they feel more like quiet observers than something malicious. They never try to harm me. They never make themselves known for long. They simply watch. And while I still don't know exactly what happened during those nights as a child, I know one thing for certain. The fear I felt was very real, and those memories have stayed with me for the rest of my life. When I was growing up, my mother worked at a prison. She wasn't a correctional officer and didn't work directly as a guard. Instead, she worked in the education department, helping with programs designed for inmates. As a child, I never thought much about her job. To me, it was simply the place she went every morning before coming home in the evening. I knew it was a prison, but I didn't truly understand the kinds of people she encountered there, or the things she heard on a daily basis. One thing I did notice, though, was a strange rule she suddenly introduced when I was young. My sister and I were no longer allowed to wear our hair in ponytails. At the time, it seemed completely random. There had been no discussion, no explanation, and no obvious reason for it. One day we wore our hair however we wanted, and the next day my mother insisted that it stay down. As a child, I found it incredibly frustrating. I was a tomboy and hated having my hair hanging in my face. Ponytails were practical. They kept my hair out of the way when I was running around, climbing trees, playing sports, or getting dirty outside. Having to leave it down felt uncomfortable and annoying. I argued about it more than once because, from my perspective, the rule made absolutely no sense. Whenever I asked why, my mother would brush off the question or change the subject. She never gave a real answer. She simply insisted that our hair stay down. Looking back now, I realize she probably struggled with how to explain something so disturbing to children who were far too young to understand it. Eventually, after enough complaints from me, she agreed to let me cut my hair shorter. Once it was cut, the issue disappeared. I was happy because I no longer had to deal with hair constantly getting in my way, and she seemed relieved as well. At the time, I thought the matter was settled. Years passed before I finally learned the truth. By then, I was much older and capable of understanding the darker realities of the world. One day the topic came up, and I asked her again about that strange period when she wouldn't let us wear our hair up. This time, she told me. The explanation was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Around that time, a new inmate had arrived at the prison where she worked. His crime was so horrific that even among other inmates, it stood out as particularly disturbing. He had murdered his own 5-year-old daughter. The details were almost impossible to comprehend. According to what my mother learned, he had assaulted the little girl in an unimaginably cruel way. During the attack, she suffered catastrophic injuries. Rather than seeking help or trying to save her life, he allowed her to die. Afterward, he attempted to hide what he had done. He wrapped her body in a carpet and concealed it in the attic of the home. The crime might have remained hidden even longer if he had not eventually been caught while attempting to move her remains. Hearing those facts alone was horrifying. But what affected my mother most was not just the crime itself. It was the man. Because of her position in the education department, she occasionally interacted with inmates in ways that allowed her to observe them outside the context of security and discipline. She heard conversations, She saw how they behaved when they thought they were speaking casually. This inmate often talked about his daughter. What disturbed everyone was the way he spoke about her. There was no genuine remorse, no visible guilt, no overwhelming grief over what he had done. Instead, he would sometimes refer to her as his girl. He spoke about her appearance. He talked about how pretty she was. He talked about how much he loved her. At first glance, those statements might sound like comments from a grieving father. But they weren't. The more he talked, the more disturbing the conversation became. He would fixate on specific physical details. One thing he mentioned repeatedly was the back of her neck. He talked about it in a way that made people deeply uncomfortable. He described how delicate it looked, how vulnerable it seemed, how much he liked it. Over time, he became increasingly open about the things that attracted him. One of the details he obsessed over was little girls wearing their hair up. He described ponytails. He described how exposed the back of the neck became when hair was pulled away from the face. He talked about how delicate it looked, how easy it was to grab, how much he liked seeing it. The things he said were not merely unsettling, they were sickening. For my mother, the experience was deeply traumatic. Every day she went to work knowing that this man existed. Every day she heard fragments of conversations she wished she could forget. She saw firsthand how someone capable of committing such a crime could appear calm, ordinary, and conversational. That realization frightened her. As a parent, she could not separate those experiences from her own children. When she came home and saw my sister and me, she didn't see abstract discussions anymore. She saw two young girls. She saw the same age range that this man constantly talked about. She saw ponytails. She saw exposed necks. And she remembered every disturbing thing he had said. It wasn't a rational decision based on any immediate danger. The inmate was locked away and unable to reach us. But fear is not always rational. Sometimes it settles into a person's mind and refuses to leave. My mother was carrying the weight of knowledge that most people never have to carry. She spent her days exposed to stories and individuals that represented the worst parts of humanity. Then, she came home and looked at the people she loved most in the world. Suddenly, something as simple as a ponytail became impossible for her to see the same way again. What seemed like a harmless hairstyle to everyone else had become connected to the disturbing thoughts and fantasies of a monster. So, she made a rule. No ponytails. No hair tied up. Hair down whenever possible. At the time, my sister and I thought she was being unreasonable. We saw only the rule itself. We never saw the fear behind it. We never saw the images she was trying to push out of her mind. We never understood that every time she looked at our hair pulled back, she was reminded of conversations she desperately wished she had never heard. As children, we often assume our parents make rules for simple reasons. We rarely consider that some decisions come from experiences they cannot explain to us. Looking back now, I understand that she was doing the only thing she knew how to do. She was protecting us in the way that made sense to her, even if the danger itself wasn't physically present. The truth is that she wasn't reacting to our hairstyles. She was reacting to the realization that people like that inmate existed. She had looked directly into the mind of someone capable of unimaginable cruelty and had come away forever changed by what she saw. That knowledge followed her home every evening. It sat with her at the dinner table. It rode with her in the car. It appeared in quiet moments when she watched her children playing. As a child, I saw only an annoying rule that kept me from wearing my hair the way I liked. As an adult, I see something entirely different. I see a mother carrying the emotional burden of her work. I see a woman exposed to the darkest corners of human behavior and struggling to keep those horrors separate from her family life. Most importantly, I see someone who loved her children so fiercely that even an indirect reminder of danger became unbearable. What seemed irrational when I was young makes perfect sense now. It was never about fashion. It was never about control. It was about a mother who had learned something terrible about the world and could not bear to see even the smallest reminder of it when she looked at her daughters. Years later, I still think about that conversation. It changed the way I viewed my mother's job and the emotional cost that came with it. People often focus on prison staff as professionals performing a duty, but they are also human beings who absorb what they witness. They hear stories, encounter offenders, and sometimes carry those experiences home with them long after their shift has ended. For my mother, one inmate left a mark that never fully disappeared. For me, the memory serves as a reminder that many of the things our parents do when we are children are motivated by fears and experiences we cannot yet understand. What looked like a strange and frustrating rule at the time was actually the response of a loving mother trying to shield her daughters from a reality she wished did not exist. Only years later did I finally understand why seeing our hair in ponytails had been so difficult for her. And once I knew the reason, I never questioned it again. For most of her life, she believed her father had simply abandoned the family. That was the story she had been told since she was a little girl growing up on a rural farm in North Carolina. One day he was there, and then he wasn't. Adults spoke about it in hushed voices whenever the subject came up. The explanation was always vague, but consistent. He had left. He had walked away from his wife and daughter and started a new life somewhere else. As a child, she accepted that answer because she had no reason not to. Children trust the stories they are given by the adults around them. Even when those stories don't fully make sense, they become part of reality. Still, there was one thing she could never completely explain. A memory. Not a clear memory, not something she could confidently describe or place in a timeline. Just a brief image that occasionally surfaced from somewhere deep inside her mind. She would see her father's face. Not standing in the yard. Not sitting at the kitchen table. Not driving away. She remembered seeing his face in the old outdoor privy that once stood behind the farmhouse. The image never lasted long. It would appear for a moment and then disappear. For years she dismissed it as nonsense, the kind of strange fragment children sometimes invent and later mistake for a memory. Life moved on. She grew up, left childhood behind, and became a middle-aged woman with a family and responsibilities of her own. Decades passed. But the memory never completely vanished. Every so often it would return, bringing with it a strange feeling she couldn't explain. The older she became, the more unsettling it felt. Why would she remember something like that? Why would her father's face be associated with an old privy? And why did the image feel so real? Eventually, she began discussing these lingering childhood memories with a therapist. The conversations turned toward her father and his disappearance. She explained how she had spent most of her life carrying unanswered questions about him. According to family lore, he had abandoned them when she was around 5 years old. Yet something about that explanation had always felt incomplete. Her therapist suggested exploring the memories more deeply. One method discussed was hypnotic regression. Today, the practice remains controversial, with many experts warning that hypnosis can sometimes create false memories rather than recover genuine ones. At the time, however, it was viewed by some therapists as a possible way to uncover forgotten details buried beneath decades of emotional distance. The woman agreed to try. What happened next would eventually attract attention far beyond her therapy sessions. During the process, additional memories began to surface. At first, they were fragmented. small flashes, disconnected images, sensations rather than complete events. She remembered waking up during the night as a child. She remembered walking through the farmhouse. She remembered entering the kitchen. And she remembered seeing her mother cleaning something from the floor. The substance appeared dark, wet. She recalled her mother frantically mopping. According to the memory, her mother immediately became angry upon seeing her. She allegedly told the little girl to go back to bed. Immediately, without questions, without explanation. The memory ended there. For most people, such recollections would have remained private family mysteries. But the woman could not shake the feeling that these fragments connected somehow to her father's disappearance. As more details emerged, local authorities became interested. After all, her father had never actually been located. There had been no confirmed sightings, no verified evidence that he had started a new life elsewhere. Only assumptions. And assumptions are not proof. Investigators began examining the case. The farmhouse still existed. Remarkably, her elderly mother still lived there. The old privy itself had long since disappeared, but its location was known. As investigators reviewed the information, attention increasingly focused on that spot. The daughter's recurring memory of seeing her father's face there suddenly seemed far less random than it once had. Eventually, authorities sought permission to excavate the area. A warrant was obtained. Excavation crews arrived at the property. Neighbors watched. Local reporters began paying attention. What had started as an obscure family mystery was becoming front-page news. People throughout the community followed developments closely. The case unfolded in real time. Every new discovery generated speculation. Every newspaper edition brought another update. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Human remains were found. Buried beneath the location where the old privy had once stood, investigators quickly determined the remains belonged to the missing father. The man who had supposedly abandoned his family decades earlier had never left the farm at all. He had been there the entire time. The discovery shocked the community. For years, people had believed a simple story about a husband walking away from his family. Now that narrative appeared completely false. According to reports at the time, the remains showed evidence suggesting the body had been dismembered before disposal. Investigators believed this may have been done to fit the remains into the narrow space available beneath the privy. The implications were horrifying. The daughter who had spent her entire life wondering why her father abandoned her was suddenly forced to confront a completely different possibility. Maybe he hadn't left. Maybe he had been murdered. And if so, who had done it? Attention immediately turned toward the only obvious suspect. His wife. The woman who had lived on the property for decades. The woman who had allegedly been present the night her husband vanished. The woman who had told everyone he had simply left. The case rapidly gained momentum. Law enforcement officials began assembling evidence. Prosecutors reviewed witness statements and investigative findings. Reporters descended on the story. For residents of the area, it became impossible to ignore. People discussed it at diners, gas stations, churches, and grocery stores. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a theory. Some believed the elderly woman was guilty. Others wondered whether there were circumstances no one yet understood. The most remarkable aspect of the story was the passage of time. The alleged crime had occurred decades earlier. Many witnesses were dead. Memories had faded. Physical evidence was limited. Building a criminal case after so many years would be extraordinarily difficult. Nevertheless, authorities appeared determined to move forward. As prosecutors weighed their options, public interest reached a fever pitch. Then, the story took one final tragic turn. Before any courtroom battle could fully begin, the elderly mother made a decision that ensured many questions would never receive definitive answers. Reports indicated that she drove out onto a remote section of the family property, a quiet area away from the house, away from the reporters, away from investigators, away from everyone. She carried a pistol with her. Not long afterward, she was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. With her death, the possibility of hearing her complete version of events vanished forever. Any explanations she might have offered disappeared with her. Any confessions, any denials, any details known only to her. Gone, the case immediately became even more mysterious. People began debating what her final act meant. Some viewed it as an admission of guilt. Others argued that fear, stress, age, and public scrutiny could have driven anyone to despair, regardless of innocence or guilt. Without a trial, there would never be a legal resolution. Without testimony, there would never be complete certainty. The daughter's recovered memories remained a central part of the story. To some observers, they appeared astonishingly accurate. After all, her recollections had ultimately led investigators to the location of her father's remains. To others, the case raised complicated questions about memory itself. How much had she truly remembered? How much had been reconstructed over time? How much had been influenced by therapy? Those questions continue to generate debate whenever the case is discussed. What remains undeniable, however, is the extraordinary sequence of events. A little girl grows up believing her father abandoned the family. Decades later, a strange childhood memory refuses to disappear. A therapist encourages exploration of the memory. Additional fragments emerge. Investigators become interested. A long-forgotten location is excavated. Human remains are discovered. A missing person case transforms into a homicide investigation. And before justice can fully run its course, the primary suspect dies, taking many answers to the grave. For the community that followed the story, it felt almost unbelievable. It contained all the elements of a mystery novel: buried secrets, lost memories, family tragedy, and a shocking discovery hidden beneath ordinary ground for decades. Yet it was real. Somewhere beneath an old farm, hidden beneath a structure most people barely noticed, a secret had remained buried for years. A secret that survived changing seasons, passing decades, and the gradual fading of memory. In the end, the truth emerged not because of a confession or a witness, but because one woman could never completely forget a single image from childhood. An image that haunted her for most of her life. A face. A glimpse. A memory of her father where he should never have been. And when investigators finally looked beneath that forgotten spot, they discovered that the child she once was had been remembering something important all along. One of the strangest experiences of my childhood happened during a family vacation by the sea. Even though many years have passed since then, I still think about it from time to time because I have never been able to fully explain what happened that night. At the time, I was only 6 or 7 years old. My family had rented a beautiful house near the coast for a short holiday. It was the kind of place that looked amazing during the day, but felt completely different after dark. The house itself was unusual. The living room and kitchen had large glass walls and sections of glass ceiling that gave an almost panoramic view of the yard outside. During the daytime, it was incredible because sunlight filled the entire house and you could see the surrounding area from almost every angle. At night, however, all those windows created a completely different atmosphere. Once darkness fell, the glass walls became giant mirrors reflecting the inside of the house, while also revealing glimpses of the darkness beyond. If someone had been standing outside, you would probably have been able to see them. There were only 2 bedrooms in the house, and since there were 5 of us staying there, my parents, my aunt, my grandmother, and me, I ended up sharing a room with my mother. I didn't mind at all. I was still young, and honestly, sleeping in the same room as my mom made me feel safer in an unfamiliar place. The first few days of the vacation were completely normal. We spent our time enjoying the beach, exploring nearby areas, eating together, and relaxing. Nothing strange happened, and I quickly became comfortable in the house. Then came the night that I still remember all these years later. It was sometime around 1 o'clock in the morning. I suddenly woke up for reasons I didn't immediately understand. The room was dark, except for a faint glow coming through the curtains from outdoor lights somewhere nearby. For a few moments, I simply lay there trying to figure out why I had awakened. Then I felt something wet running down my arm. At first, I thought it might have been water or sweat. Confused, I touched my arm and immediately realized it wasn't either of those things. It was blood. A fresh scratch or cut had appeared on my arm while I was sleeping. Even now, I can't explain where it came from. The wound wasn't severe, but it was enough to leave blood running down my skin. I stared at it for several seconds. At 6 or 7 years old, seeing blood unexpectedly in the middle of the night was terrifying. I looked over at my mother. She was sleeping soundly beside me. For some reason, instead of waking her immediately, I decided to handle the situation myself. Looking back, that decision seems strange because most children would instantly wake a parent. But at that age, I think I simply didn't want to bother her. I convinced myself that I could figure it out on my own. Quietly, I got out of bed and walked toward the living room. The house felt completely different at night. The cheerful vacation home we had enjoyed during the day now felt enormous and unsettling. The silence seemed louder. Every small sound felt amplified. As I stepped into the living room, I could see the dark yard outside through the large glass walls. That was when something happened that immediately filled me with fear. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure move past one of the windows. It happened incredibly fast. One moment, there was nothing there. The next moment, something seemed to flash across the glass. I froze instantly. My heart began pounding. Even now, I can still remember the feeling. I couldn't tell what the figure was. I couldn't make out a face. I couldn't even tell whether it was a person. All I knew was that something had moved outside. At least that's what I thought I saw. The darkness beyond the glass suddenly felt much closer than before. I stood there staring toward the yard. Nothing moved. Everything was silent. Yet the feeling of being watched settled heavily over me. I wanted to run back to my room immediately. But another thought entered my mind. What if someone had gotten inside? The idea terrified me. I turned and hurried toward the front door. I wanted to make sure it was locked. As I approached it, another shock awaited me. The door wasn't closed properly. In fact, it was partially open. Not wide open, just enough to create a narrow gap. The sight instantly sent a wave of panic through me. I knew the adults always locked the doors before going to bed. Seeing it open in the middle of the night felt wrong. Very wrong. I grabbed the door and pushed it shut as firmly as I could. Then I checked it several times to make sure it was closed. By this point, I was completely terrified. My imagination was racing. I kept thinking about the figure outside. I kept thinking about the unexplained scratch on my arm. And now the front door had somehow been left open. I didn't want to be alone anymore. Without hesitation, I ran back to the bedroom and woke my mother. At first, she was confused. She sat up slowly and asked what was wrong. I immediately began telling her everything. I explained that I had woken up bleeding. I told her about the figure outside the window. Then I told her about finding the front door partially open. As I spoke, the fear in my voice quickly got her attention. Within minutes, everyone else in the house was awake as well. My father, aunt, and grandmother gathered in the living room while we explained what had happened. Naturally, everyone checked the house. They searched every room. They looked outside. They inspected the doors and windows. But nothing seemed out of place. No one was there. There were no signs of a break-in. No evidence that anybody had entered the property. Still, everyone agreed that the situation was strange. The open door bothered all of us. None of the adults remembered leaving it that way. Eventually, since it was the middle of the night and there was little else we could do, everyone returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The blood on my arm, the figure outside, the partially open door. The entire situation felt wrong. The next morning, my family decided to speak with the owner of the rental house. Fortunately, the property had security cameras covering parts of the exterior and entry areas. The owner had access to the recordings. Everyone hoped the footage would provide an explanation. Part of me expected to see someone walking around outside. Maybe a stranger had approached the house. Maybe someone had tried the front door. Maybe the cameras would reveal the figure I thought I had seen. We gathered together as the owner reviewed the footage. At first, everything looked completely normal. Hours of uneventful recordings passed. Then we reached the time period from the night before. What we saw left all of us speechless. The cameras showed me leaving the bedroom. That part made sense. I remembered waking up and walking through the house, but then the footage revealed something I had absolutely no memory of. Approximately 30 minutes before I remembered waking up, the cameras showed me walking through the house and opening the front door myself. I stared at the screen in disbelief. According to the footage, I had gotten out of bed, walked directly to the door, opened it, and then returned inside. The strange part was that I had absolutely no memory of doing any of it. None. As far as I was concerned, I had only woken up once that night. Yet the cameras clearly showed otherwise. The timestamps confirmed everything. My family compared the times carefully. The footage proved that the door had been opened earlier, and the person who opened it was me. No one entered the house afterward. No stranger appeared outside. No suspicious figure approached the property. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just me, walking to the door, opening it, and apparently returning to bed. The discovery created even more questions than answers. Why would I open the door in the middle of the night? How could I have no memory of doing it? Was I sleepwalking? If so, why had nobody noticed before? The more we discussed it, the stranger it seemed. Sleepwalking appeared to be the most logical explanation. Children are known to sleepwalk. Many do things during sleep that they later have no memory of. Yet that explanation still didn't account for everything. It didn't explain why I thought I saw a figure outside. It didn't explain the overwhelming feeling of fear I experienced. And it certainly didn't explain the scratch on my arm that had been bleeding when I woke up. Perhaps there were ordinary explanations for all of those things. Maybe I scratched myself accidentally while sleeping. Maybe shadows and reflections created the illusion of movement outside. Maybe my young imagination amplified the fear. All of those possibilities make sense. Yet even now, something about the experience continues to bother me. What stands out most is not the figure, or even the open door. It's the missing memory. The idea that I apparently got out of bed, walked through the house, opened the front door, and returned to my room without remembering any of it is deeply unsettling. To this day, I still remember waking up and discovering the blood on my arm. I remember walking through the dark house. I remember seeing something move outside the window. I remember finding the door open. But I have absolutely no memory of the earlier event captured on camera. It's as though an entire portion of that night simply vanished from my mind. Years have passed since that vacation, and I've never experienced anything exactly like it again. I've tried many times to make sense of it. Perhaps it really was sleepwalking. Perhaps everything that happened had a completely ordinary explanation. But even now, whenever I think about that night, I can't shake the feeling that something doesn't quite add up. The footage proved that nobody entered the house. The cameras showed no intruders, no mysterious visitors, no obvious explanation for the fear that consumed me. All they showed was a little child opening a door in the middle of the night and somehow forgetting it ever happened. And honestly, that's the part that still scares me the most. About 8 years ago, I had an experience that still unsettles me whenever I think about it. Even after all this time, I can remember every detail with incredible clarity. Most childhood memories fade over the years, becoming blurry around the edges, but this one has remained sharp and vivid. What makes it even more disturbing is that decades before it happened to me, the exact same thing happened to my father in the very same room. To this day, neither of us can explain it. When I was younger, I often stayed at my grandparents' house. It was a place filled with family history and memories. I loved visiting them because their house always felt warm and welcoming. Usually, when I stayed overnight, I slept in a guest room. It was familiar, comfortable, and I never had any problems sleeping there. Then one summer, everything changed. For reasons I don't remember, my grandparents decided to have me sleep in my father's old bedroom. It was the room he had used when he was growing up. I thought it was interesting more than anything else. As a kid, I liked hearing stories about my father when he was younger, so sleeping in his old room felt special. The room itself seemed completely normal. There was nothing creepy about it. Nothing felt unusual. It looked like any ordinary bedroom in an older family home. There were old pieces of furniture, family photographs throughout the house, and the familiar smell that many grandparents' homes seem to have. Everything felt safe and familiar. That evening was completely normal. We ate dinner together, watched television for a while, and spent time talking before everyone headed to bed. I remember feeling tired and falling asleep fairly quickly. At some point during the night, I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The room was dark, illuminated only by faint moonlight coming through the window. Everything seemed normal for a few seconds. Then I realized something was wrong. I couldn't move. At first, I thought maybe I was still sleepy. I tried moving my arms. Nothing happened. I tried sitting up. Nothing happened. My entire body felt frozen. Panic immediately began to build inside me. I had never experienced anything like it before. As a child, I didn't know what sleep paralysis was. I had never heard of it and had no explanation for what was happening. All I knew was that I was awake, aware of my surroundings, and completely unable to move. The harder I tried to move, the more frightened I became. Every second felt longer than the last. I remember staring into the darkness while my heart pounded so hard that I could hear it. The room suddenly felt different. The familiar space I had fallen asleep in no longer felt safe. It felt wrong. Time seemed to slow down. What was probably only a few moments felt like an eternity. Eventually, the paralysis began to fade. At least, that's how I remember it. The sensation of being trapped in my own body slowly loosened, and I finally managed to move. The instant I could, I rolled out of bed. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to get out of that room. I wanted to find my grandparents. I wanted reassurance that everything was okay. I rushed out of the bedroom and headed toward my grandparents' room. The hallway seemed strangely quiet. Even the house felt different. Normally, walking through the house at night never bothered me. That night, every shadow seemed dark. Every corner felt unsettling. When I reached my grandparents' bedroom, I expected to find them sleeping peacefully. Instead, the room was empty. I froze. At first, I thought I must be mistaken. Maybe I had gone into the wrong room. Maybe they were somewhere else in the house. I searched frantically, but I couldn't find them. The house felt completely deserted. A deep feeling of dread settled over me. Something wasn't right. I began walking through the house, calling for them. No answer came. The silence felt overwhelming. Then things became much stranger. As I turned around to leave the room, I noticed movement. People. At first, there was only one, then another, then dozens. Suddenly, the room began filling with people I had never seen before. They appeared from nowhere. Men, women, young, old faces I didn't recognize. People I had never met in my life. The room became crowded within seconds. Everywhere I looked, there were strangers. They were talking to each other constantly. The sound filled the room, yet none of it made any sense. The words sounded jumbled and incoherent. It was as if everyone was speaking a language I couldn't understand, or perhaps multiple languages at once. The noise became overwhelming. I remember trying to focus on individual voices, hoping to understand what they were saying. But I couldn't. Nothing sounded normal. Nothing sounded human. It was just endless, meaningless conversation echoing all around me. Then I noticed something else. Every single one of them was staring at me. Not casually, not occasionally. Every single person in that crowd had their eyes fixed directly on me. The expressions on their faces weren't angry. They weren't smiling either. They simply stared. Their eyes seemed unnaturally wide, far wider than any normal person's eyes should be. The sight was horrifying. I remember backing away slowly. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Every instinct told me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was packed. The strangers continued talking, continued staring, continued moving closer. Then the crowd suddenly parted. At first I didn't understand why. The people seemed to move aside as though making room for someone. Or something. That was when I saw it. A massive figure emerged from the crowd. Even now, describing it makes me uncomfortable. The figure was enormous. It towered over everyone else. Its head nearly seemed to touch the ceiling. The people around it looked tiny by comparison. As it moved forward, the crowd seemed to disappear into the background. My entire attention became focused on that one figure. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look at it. But I couldn't stop. The figure continued walking toward me. Slowly, deliberately, each step felt impossibly heavy. The closer it came, the more terrified I became. Instinctively, I backed into a corner. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to wake up. I wanted any explanation for what I was seeing. But none came. The giant figure kept approaching. I tried to see its face. I couldn't. No matter how hard I looked, its features remained hidden. It was as though my mind refused to process what should have been there. I knew where the face should have been, yet I couldn't make out any details. That somehow made it even worse. As the figure stood over me, it began speaking. The voice was unlike anything I had ever heard. Deep, distorted, incomprehensible, words came out continuously, but none of them made sense. The sounds blended together into something impossible to understand. I desperately tried to scream. Nothing came out. I opened my mouth. I forced every ounce of energy into making a sound, but my voice simply wouldn't work. The panic became overwhelming. I felt completely helpless. The crowd watched. The giant figure continued speaking, and I remained trapped. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. The entire experience seemed endless. Then suddenly, I woke up. I was back in bed. The room was dark. Everything was quiet. For several moments, I simply lay there breathing heavily. My entire body felt cold. My heart was racing. I looked around desperately. The room was empty. No crowd. No giant figure. No strange voices. Nothing. Yet the fear remained. The experience had felt completely real. Far more real than any dream I had ever had. I barely slept for the rest of the night. Every shadow in the room made me nervous. Every small noise caught my attention. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for morning. When daylight finally arrived, I felt relieved. But I was also embarrassed. Part of me worried people would think I was imagining things. So I didn't tell my grandparents. I kept the experience to myself. Later, however, I decided to tell my father. I figured he would understand better than anyone. As I described what had happened, I expected him to laugh it off. Maybe he would tell me it was just a nightmare. Maybe he would explain sleep paralysis. Maybe he would reassure me that everything was normal. Instead, something happened that frightened me even more. The expression on his face changed completely. He looked genuinely terrified. At first, I thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't. As I continued describing the experience, he became increasingly uncomfortable. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then he told me something I will never forget. The exact same thing had happened to him. In that room, when he was around my age. Not something similar, not vaguely comparable. The exact same experience. He described waking up unable to move. He described seeing strangers. He described the overwhelming crowd. He described the towering figure. Even the feeling of trying to scream while no sound came out matched his experience. The event had happened more than 30 years before mine. Yet his description mirrored my own in ways that seemed impossible. I remember sitting there, completely stunned. Part of me wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe the room itself wasn't important. Maybe sleep paralysis commonly creates similar hallucinations. Maybe our minds had somehow influenced each other through stories I had forgotten hearing. But there was one problem. I had never heard his story before. Not once. He had never told me about it. As far as I knew, nothing unusual had ever happened in that room. Yet somehow, decades apart, we experienced what felt like the same terrifying encounter. To this day, neither of us knows exactly what happened. We've discussed it many times over the years. We've tried finding explanations. We've read about sleep paralysis and the vivid hallucinations that often accompany it. Many aspects of our experiences match known symptoms, yet something about the similarities continues to bother us. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps the human brain creates similar fears under similar circumstances. Or perhaps there is another explanation neither of us understands. Whatever the truth may be, one thing has never changed. Neither of us has forgotten that night. Even now, decades after my father's experience, and years after mine, we can both recall every detail with disturbing clarity. The crowded room. The endless voices, the wide, staring eyes, and the enormous faceless figures slowly making its way through the crowd. Some memories fade over time. This one never did. And whenever either of us talks about it, the feeling of fear returns just as strongly as it did the first time. Back in 2005, social media was still relatively new. People were meeting online more often than ever before, but there wasn't the same awareness of online safety that exists today. Sites like MySpace were exploding in popularity, and AOL Instant Messenger was one of the main ways people stayed in touch. Most people saw the internet as exciting and convenient. Very few imagined that someone they met online could be genuinely dangerous. At the time, I was seeing a girl who lived near me. We talked constantly and spent a lot of time together. One evening, I started trying to get in touch with her, but something felt off almost immediately. I called her phone. No answer. I sent a text. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. At first, I wasn't particularly worried. People miss calls all the time. Phones die. Sometimes they get busy or forget to respond. But as more time passed, I started getting a bad feeling. Eventually, after repeated attempts, she finally answered. The moment I heard her voice, I could tell something was wrong. She sounded nervous, not just distracted or annoyed. Actually, scared. She told me she was at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and that she was stuck inside a guy's dorm room. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood what she was saying. Then she explained that she was locked inside. The more she talked, the more alarmed I became. I asked what was going on, who the guy was, and why she couldn't leave. The details were confusing, but one thing was obvious. She wanted out. My concern immediately turned into anger. I asked to speak to the guy. To my surprise, he actually got on the phone. The conversation quickly turned hostile. I demanded to know why she wasn't being allowed to leave. He became defensive almost immediately. The argument escalated within seconds. Neither of us was interested in being polite. The situation sounded dangerous, and I wasn't interested in excuses. I told him I was coming to campus. I remember making it very clear that if she wasn't free to leave when I got there, there was going to be a problem. At the time, I wasn't thinking strategically. I wasn't considering consequences. I was just angry and worried about someone I cared about. So I got in my car and headed toward campus. The entire drive there, my mind raced through different possibilities. Maybe there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe the guy was drunk. Maybe she was exaggerating. Or maybe she was genuinely trapped with someone dangerous. I honestly didn't know. I just knew I wanted to get there as quickly as possible. Before I arrived, she called again. This time she sounded calmer. She told me she had managed to get out. Relief hit me immediately. When I reached campus, I picked her up. My first instinct was still to find the guy. The argument on the phone had left me furious. Part of me wanted to confront him face to face and make sure he understood exactly how serious the situation had been. But she strongly advised against it. What she said next stuck with me. She told me he seemed really creepy, not just rude, not just socially awkward, genuinely unsettling. The kind of person who gave off a feeling that something wasn't right. She didn't want any further contact with him. She wanted to leave and put the whole experience behind her. So that's what we did. At the time, I viewed the entire incident as disturbing, but ultimately over. I figured we'd encountered some strange guy, avoided a potentially bad situation, and moved on. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few days later, something happened that made the situation much more alarming. Out of nowhere, the guy found me online. This was during the AOL Instant Messenger era. Back then, people spent hours chatting through AIM, using screen names rather than real identities. The internet was a very different place from what it is today. Most people weren't broadcasting every detail of their lives online. Search engines weren't nearly as powerful. Social media was still developing. Finding personal information about someone generally required effort. Yet somehow, this guy found me. Not only did he find my screen name, but he started sending messages. At first, the messages were aggressive. Then they became threatening. The more he typed, the more disturbing they became. He wasn't just insulting me, he was trying to intimidate me. What really caught my attention was how much information he seemed to have. He knew my full legal name. He knew where I lived. He knew details that felt far too personal. I remember staring at the screen wondering how he had gotten any of it. Today, people often underestimate how unsettling that would have felt in 2005. Information wasn't as readily available. There weren't endless public profiles and social media accounts containing every detail of a person's life. For him to know that information felt invasive and threatening, the messages escalated further. Eventually, he began threatening violence, not just toward me, toward the girl as well. He talked about killing us. The language was graphic and disturbing. Looking back now, those messages should have been treated as a major warning sign. At the time, however, I interpreted them differently. I assumed he was bluffing. The internet was full of people making threats they would never act on. Every forum, every chat room, and every messaging platform had people who acted tough online, but would never do anything in real life. I figured he was one of those people. A keyboard warrior. Someone who enjoyed intimidating others from behind a screen. So I pushed back. I told him I wasn't scared. I told him he could meet me anytime he wanted. If he wanted a confrontation, he knew where to find me. I believed I was calling his bluff. The conversation eventually ended, and after a while the messages stopped. Life continued. Weeks passed. The incident slowly faded into the background. Then, the news broke. A young woman had gone missing after meeting a man she had connected with online through MySpace. As details emerged, the story became increasingly horrifying. The woman had gone on what she believed would be a normal date. Instead, she encountered a predator. Authorities eventually discovered that she had been brutally murdered. The violence involved in the crime shocked everyone who learned about it. Investigators revealed details that were difficult to comprehend. The victim had been sexually assaulted and killed. Her body had been mutilated in an apparent attempt to make identification more difficult. The cruelty of the crime horrified the community. As the investigation unfolded, a name was released. The suspect was the same man who had argued with me on the phone. The same man who had locked that girl in his dorm room. The same man who had tracked me down online and threatened to kill both of us. For a moment, it didn't feel real. I remember reading the reports and feeling an overwhelming sense of disbelief. Out of all the people in the world, it was him. The creepy guy. The guy everyone felt uneasy around. The guy whose threats I had dismissed. Suddenly, every interaction I'd had with him looked different. Every message, every threat, every warning sign. What I had assumed was the behavior of an angry, socially awkward person was actually something much darker. The realization was chilling. I started replaying events in my head. What if she hadn't gotten out of that dorm room? What if I hadn't answered my phone? What if things had unfolded differently? Those questions haunted me. Because now there was proof that this wasn't someone making empty threats. This wasn't someone pretending to be dangerous. He actually was dangerous. Extremely dangerous. As the case progressed, investigators uncovered more evidence. The public learned more about the crime. The details painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual capable of extraordinary violence. Eventually, faced with overwhelming evidence, he chose to plead guilty. By doing so, he avoided the possibility of receiving the death penalty. The case officially came to an end, but the impact lingered for everyone connected to it. For most people, the story was a headline. A shocking crime featured on television and in newspapers. For me, it felt much more personal. I had spoken to him, argued with him, been threatened by him. I had seen a glimpse of who he really was before the rest of the world knew. At the time, I failed to recognize what those warning signs meant. Like many people, I assumed that most threats were just talk. Most of the time, that assumption is correct. But occasionally, it isn't. Occasionally, the person on the other side of the screen isn't pretending. Occasionally, they're exactly who they appear to be. That's what makes the memory so unsettling all these years later. It's not just that a murderer once sent me threats online. It's the realization of how close ordinary people can come to genuine danger without ever realizing it. One moment you're arguing with someone you think is simply obnoxious. The next, you're watching their face on the evening news and learning they committed one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. The internet often creates the illusion of distance and safety. We assume dangerous people are far away, easily identifiable, and obvious. The truth is often very different. Sometimes they're only one conversation away. Sometimes they're one bad decision away from becoming a headline. And sometimes, long before the world learns who they really are, they reveal just enough of themselves to leave a feeling that something isn't right. In this case, that feeling turned out to be absolutely correct. The girl trusted her instincts. She wanted nothing more to do with him, because something about him felt wrong. Weeks later, the world learned just how right she had been. That realization has stayed with me ever since. For years, people living near the lake thought it was just another beautiful part of the landscape. It sat quietly between the mountains, calm and seemingly harmless. The water reflected the sky like a giant mirror, and generations of villagers lived their entire lives nearby without ever suspecting that something deadly was slowly building beneath the surface. There were no warning signs, no strange creatures emerging from the water, no stories of monsters, no visible danger. The lake appeared completely ordinary. But deep below the surface, a silent process had been taking place for decades. The region sat in an area shaped by ancient volcanic activity. Although the volcanoes themselves appeared inactive, the earth beneath the lake was still releasing gases from deep underground. Tiny amounts of carbon dioxide continuously seeped upward through cracks in the rock below the lake bed. Normally, carbon dioxide isn't something people fear. It's a natural gas that exists all around us. We exhale it every time we breathe. Plants use it to grow. In small amounts, it's harmless. But this wasn't a small amount. Year after year, decade after decade, the gas accumulated in the deepest layers of the lake. Because the water at the bottom was under immense pressure, enormous quantities of carbon dioxide remained dissolved there, hidden from sight. The lake was slowly becoming a giant natural storage tank filled with compressed gas. Nobody knew how much had accumulated. Nobody realized how unstable the situation had become. Life around the lake continued as normal. Families farmed the surrounding land. Children played near the shoreline. Fishermen worked the water. Animals grazed nearby, Birds nested in the trees. Entire communities built their lives around the lake, never imagining that one day it would become the source of one of the strangest natural disasters in history. Then, without warning, everything changed. One evening, the earth shook. The tremor itself wasn't particularly remarkable. Earthquakes occur all over the world, and many are so minor that people barely notice them. But this one was enough. Deep beneath the surface, the movement disturbed the delicate balance that had existed within the lake for years. The water shifted, pressure changed, and suddenly, the carbon dioxide that had remained trapped at the bottom began rising toward the surface. What happened next has often been compared to opening a shaken bottle of soda. When a bottle is sealed, carbon dioxide remains dissolved within the liquid because of pressure. The moment the cap is removed, that pressure disappears and gas rapidly escapes. The same principle occurred inside the lake. As carbon dioxide-rich water rose upward, the pressure holding the gas dissolved decreased. The gas began separating from the water. Those bubbles rose, pulling even more gas-rich water upward. That water released more gas, which pulled up even more water. Within moments, a runaway chain reaction had begun. The lake essentially erupted, not with lava or fire, with gas. An enormous cloud of carbon dioxide burst from the surface and spread outward across the surrounding landscape. There was no explosion that villagers could hear from miles away. No giant fireball, no dramatic warning. The danger was almost invisible. Carbon dioxide is colorless, odorless, silent, and heavier than air. Instead of rising into the atmosphere, the cloud hugged the ground. Like an invisible flood, it spilled over the edges of the lake and began flowing downhill. Slowly, relentlessly, toward the villages below. People had no idea what was coming. Most were asleep when it arrived. Others were finishing evening chores. Some were preparing meals. Children were in bed. Farm animals rested in pens. Dogs lay sleeping outside homes. Everything seemed normal. Then, the cloud reached them. The terrifying thing about carbon dioxide is that it doesn't poison people in the traditional sense. Instead, it displaces oxygen. Victims don't necessarily feel as though they're being attacked. They simply begin breathing air that contains less and less oxygen. Confusion sets in. Weakness follows. Then, unconsciousness. Many people never had a chance to understand what was happening. There were no alarms, no visible threat to run from, no obvious reason to panic. People simply collapsed. Some died in their homes. Others died in their beds. Some were found sitting exactly where they had been moments before. The gas continued moving through the valleys. Wherever it settled, life disappeared. Livestock fell where they stood. Birds dropped from the sky. Wild animals collapsed along trails and fields. Entire families perished together. The cloud moved silently through the darkness, leaving death behind it. When daylight arrived, survivors from nearby areas were confronted with a scene that seemed impossible. Entire villages appeared frozen in time. People lay exactly where they had fallen. Animals were scattered across fields and roads. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, no obvious explanation. It looked as though life itself had simply stopped. Rescue workers entering the area initially struggled to understand what they were seeing. The scale of the disaster was enormous. Hundreds upon hundreds of people were dead. Thousands of animals had also perished. Entire communities had been wiped out within hours. For a time, many believed some kind of toxic chemical release had occurred. Others feared a volcanic eruption. Some suspected disease. The truth proved stranger than almost anyone imagined. The killer wasn't a virus. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even visible. It was a naturally occurring cloud of carbon dioxide released from the depths of a lake. Scientists eventually identified the phenomenon as a limnic eruption, one of the rarest natural disasters on Earth. Before this event, very few people even knew such a thing was possible. The lake involved was eventually recognized worldwide as one of the most chilling examples of nature's hidden dangers. Researchers discovered that massive amounts of carbon dioxide had accumulated at depth over many years before suddenly escaping in a catastrophic release. The disaster fundamentally changed scientific understanding of certain volcanic lakes around the world. Investigations revealed that other lakes possessed similar conditions and could potentially experience the same type of eruption. As a result, engineers and scientists developed systems designed to prevent future catastrophes. Special pipes were installed in some dangerous lakes to slowly release carbon dioxide before it could build to dangerous levels. By continuously venting the gas, pressure could be reduced and another massive release avoided. The tragedy ultimately saved lives elsewhere by teaching the world about a hazard few had previously recognized. Yet the human cost remains difficult to comprehend. Entire families vanished overnight. Parents, children, grandparents, friends, neighbors, and countless animals died without warning. Many never even woke up. Many never understood they were in danger. There was no dramatic escape, no final battle for survival, only silence. That may be the most haunting aspect of the disaster. Most deadly events announce themselves. Tornadoes roar. Wildfires glow on the horizon. Floods surge through streets. Earthquakes shake the ground. People know something terrible is happening. This disaster offered no such warning. An invisible cloud drifted down a mountainside in the darkness. It moved through villages while people slept. It entered homes, crossed fields, filled valleys, and when morning came, entire communities were gone. Even today, the story feels almost unreal. A peaceful lake, a hidden buildup of gas, a small disturbance deep below the surface, and then an invisible wave of death rolling silently across the landscape. It sounds like something from a horror novel, yet it actually happened. The event remains one of the strangest and most unsettling natural disasters ever recorded, because it reminds us that some of nature's greatest dangers are not the ones we can see. Sometimes the most deadly threat is completely invisible. No sound, no smell, no warning. Just a silent cloud drifting through the night, changing countless lives forever before anyone even realized it was there. A few years ago, I worked at Big Bend National Park, which sounds a lot more peaceful than it actually was. Most people imagine beautiful sunsets, scenic hiking trails, and endless desert landscapes stretching toward the horizon. And to be fair, those things were definitely there. But living and working in a place like Big Bend also means sharing the environment with wildlife that most people only ever see in documentaries. One of those animals was the mountain lion, often called a panther by locals. The park had a small population of them, and every once in a while someone would catch a glimpse of one. Usually, it was just a fleeting sighting, a shape crossing a road at dawn, a pair of eyes reflecting light in the distance, maybe a paw print in the dirt that looked much larger than you wanted it to be. The thing about mountain lions is that they're incredibly good at remaining unseen. You can spend years in their territory and never spot one. That fact fascinated me. At the time, I was living in Panther Junction, the main developed area within the park. Behind the housing area was a wash that cut through the landscape, forming a kind of shallow canyon known locally as Panther Canyon. The name wasn't just for show. People had seen mountain lions there before, and there was strong evidence that at least a couple of cats regularly moved through the area. Naturally, instead of respecting that information and staying safely indoors at night like a sensible person, I decided I wanted to find one. I became obsessed with the idea of observing a mountain lion in its natural environment, not from a vehicle, not from a distance with binoculars. I wanted to see one moving through the darkness, exactly the way it lived. So I bought a pair of night vision goggles. At the time, it seemed like a brilliant idea. I imagined myself quietly exploring the desert at night, spotting wildlife that most people never got the chance to see. The goggles weren't cheap, but once I tried them out, I felt like I had acquired some kind of superpower. Suddenly, the darkness wasn't dark anymore. The landscape glowed in eerie shades of green. Bushes, rocks, and distant terrain that would normally disappear after sunset became visible again. I was completely fascinated. The more I used them, the more confident I became. Unfortunately, confidence and intelligence are not always the same thing. One evening, a friend and I planned a nighttime expedition into Panther Canyon. The goal was simple: find evidence of the cats, maybe get lucky enough to observe one. Nothing crazy, just a little nighttime wildlife viewing. At least that was the plan. As the evening progressed, my buddy drank far more than expected. Eventually, it became obvious he wasn't going anywhere. He was done for the night. Most reasonable people would have interpreted this as a sign to postpone the trip. Instead, I decided to go alone. Looking back, that was probably the dumbest decision I've ever made. At the time, however, I felt invincible. I had my new night vision goggles. I knew the area reasonably well. I wasn't planning to get close to a mountain lion. I just wanted to observe one. What could possibly go wrong? So I set out alone into the darkness. At first, it was incredible. The desert at night feels like an entirely different world. Temperatures drop, the wind shifts, the daytime sounds disappear and are replaced by an entirely new set of noises. Every rustle suddenly seems important. Every shadow appears alive. Through the goggles, the landscape looked surreal. The canyon stretched ahead of me in glowing green detail. Plants stood out sharply against the ground. Every rock and branch seemed exaggerated. I felt like I was exploring another planet. The deeper I moved into the canyon, the more excited I became. This was exactly what I had hoped for. Adventure, solitude, the possibility of seeing something extraordinary. Then, I remembered where I was going. A known mountain lion den. That should have been the moment when common sense kicked in. Instead, I kept walking. In my mind, I was the observer, the wildlife enthusiast, the curious explorer. What never occurred to me was how the situation looked from the animal's perspective. Because while I was creeping through the darkness, trying to find a mountain lion, the mountain lion had probably known exactly where I was the entire time. It could almost certainly hear me. It could probably smell me. For all I know, it had been tracking my movement from hundreds of yards away. I was entering the territory of one of the most effective predators in North America. And I was doing it alone. At night. While wearing equipment that made me feel smarter than I actually was. Eventually, I reached what I considered a safe observation distance from the den area. I stopped moving and began scanning the terrain through the goggles. The excitement returned. This was it. This was the moment. I stared at the den entrance. Nothing, no movement, no glowing eyes, no shadowy shape, just silence. Complete silence. The kind of silence that seems heavier than normal. At first, I felt disappointed. Maybe the cat wasn't there. Maybe I had come all this way for nothing, so I kept watching. Minutes passed. Still nothing. The den looked completely empty. I remember standing there thinking something along the lines of, "Where is that panther?" And that's when the feeling hit me. It's difficult to explain. Nothing happened. There was no sound, no movement, no visible threat. Yet every instinct in my body suddenly started screaming that I was not alone. People often talk about a sixth sense. Whether it exists or not, I don't know. What I do know is that there are moments when your brain notices things before your conscious mind does. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I became intensely aware of my surroundings. Every direction suddenly seemed important. The darkness beyond the range of my goggles felt enormous. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. Not casually observing. Watching, focused, patient, the kind of attention predators give to other animals. I tried to dismiss the feeling. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was standing near a mountain lion den at night after all. Of course, my imagination was running wild. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The silence seemed unnatural. The canyon felt different now. Hostile, I slowly turned, scanning the terrain around me. Nothing. Everywhere I looked appeared empty. Yet somehow that made me more nervous rather than less. Because mountain lions are experts at remaining hidden. People hike through mountain lion territory every day without ever seeing one. That doesn't mean the cats aren't there. It just means they're better at hiding than we are at finding them. And suddenly that fact felt a lot less interesting and a lot more terrifying. I stood there for another moment. Then I heard it, a rustle. Just a small noise from nearby brush. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It could have been almost anything. A rabbit, a bird, the wind. But in that moment, my brain immediately translated it into one thing. Mountain lion. That was all I needed. Every ounce of curiosity vanished instantly. The scientific observer disappeared. The wildlife enthusiast disappeared. The adventurous explorer disappeared. What remained was a guy alone in the dark who suddenly realized he might be standing much closer to a large predator than he wanted to be. I turned around and left. Quickly. Very quickly. Okay, if I'm being completely honest, I practically ran. Whatever dignity I had carried into that canyon stayed behind. I moved back towards civilization with a speed and determination that would have impressed Olympic athletes. Every sound behind me seemed threatening. Every shadow felt suspicious. I resisted the urge to constantly look over my shoulder because I wasn't sure I wanted to know what I might see. By the time my trailer finally came into view, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I got inside, locked the door, and spent a few minutes reconsidering every life choice that had led me to that moment. The funny thing is that I never actually saw a mountain lion that night. Not once. For all I know, there wasn't one anywhere near me. But deep down, I doubt that. The more I've thought about it over the years, the more convinced I've become that the cat knew exactly where I was. I suspect it watched me approach, watched me stand there, watched me search for it, and probably watched me leave. The entire time remaining completely invisible. Which, honestly, is even more unsettling. Because it means the mountain lion won without ever revealing itself. I went into that canyon imagining I was the observer. In reality, I was probably the one being observed. The night vision goggles, however, were fantastic. I still have to give them credit for that. They worked perfectly. The problem wasn't the equipment. The problem was the idiot wearing it. I was 16 years old when it happened. I'd only recently gotten my driver's license. and I was still in that awkward stage where every trip behind the wheel felt like a major accomplishment. I wasn't the kind of kid who spent weekends partying or sneaking out. I was the quiet, nerdy guy in school, the one more comfortable with books and computers than with popularity contests and social circles. One of my closest friends was a girl in my class. She was the complete opposite of me in almost every way. She was beautiful, outgoing, and incredibly popular. The kind of girl who always seemed surrounded by people. Most of the guys in school had a crush on her at one point or another, myself included. Unfortunately for me, she had never seen me that way. Not that I blamed her. She was interested in athletes, older guys, and confident boys who seemed to know exactly who they were. I was the kid who got nervous ordering food at restaurants. Despite that, we became close friends. In many ways, I was the person she talked to when things weren't going well. She trusted me. She would send long messages about her relationships, her family, her insecurities, and the endless drama that seemed to follow her around. Then, almost immediately after sending them, she would delete them. At the time, I didn't fully understand why. Eventually, I realized it was because many of the boys she dated were possessive and controlling. They checked her phone, monitored her conversations, and became jealous over the smallest things. She learned to erase evidence of conversations she thought they wouldn't like. Looking back now, that alone should have been a warning sign. But when you're a teenager, unhealthy behavior often gets mistaken for passion. That's just how it seemed back then. One winter night, everything changed. I remember it clearly because of how unusual it was. It was a school night, very late, long after everyone should have been asleep. My phone rang. Even before I answered, I knew something was wrong. She never called. Not like that. We texted constantly, but actual phone calls were rare. A phone call in the middle of the night was almost unheard of. The moment I answered, I knew this wasn't a normal conversation. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She sounded terrified. Not upset, not emotional. Terrified. Her words were rushed and shaky. She asked me to come get her, immediately. I started asking questions, but she kept interrupting. There wasn't time. She gave me an address. Then she asked me to bring clothes, a shirt, underwear, sweatpants, specific items. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I could hear panic underneath every word. Before I could get a real explanation, she said she had to go. The line disconnected. I sat there staring at my phone. For a few moments, I didn't move. I was 16. I had no idea what was happening. But I knew one thing. She needed help. Back then, there were no smartphones, no navigation apps, no instant location sharing. I barely knew how to get around my own town. The address she gave me belonged to her boyfriend's house in another city, a city I almost never visited. I rushed to the family computer and printed directions from MapQuest. Kids today will never understand how stressful that was. If you missed a turn, you couldn't simply reroute. You had to figure it out yourself. I gathered the clothes she requested. Then I quietly left the house. I didn't want my parents waking up and asking questions. I pushed my car down the driveway before starting the engine, letting it roll silently until I was far enough away that they wouldn't hear it. The entire drive felt surreal. The roads were mostly empty. Streetlights reflected off patches of frost. Everything seemed strangely quiet. I kept replaying her voice in my head. The fear, the urgency, the way she sounded as though she was trying not to be heard. Every mile made me more nervous. I had no idea what I was driving toward. Eventually, I reached the address. The house was dark. There were no signs of activity, no music, no lights, nothing. I parked nearby and waited. A few minutes later, the front door opened, She stepped outside. Even now, after all these years, that image remains burned into my memory. She was naked, completely naked. Her hair was tangled and matted. Her makeup had been smeared across her face from crying. She looked exhausted, broken, terrified. She moved quickly and quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if she was afraid someone might see her leaving. The moment she climbed into the car, she pulled the door shut and told me to drive. Immediately, I didn't argue. I pulled away from the curb and started heading back toward home. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. She focused on putting on the clothes I had brought. Her hands were shaking. The silence inside the car felt overwhelming. Finally, I asked the obvious question. What happened? The answer came in fragments. She struggled to speak without breaking down. Through tears, she explained that she had attended her boyfriend's birthday party. That was the last thing she remembered clearly. After that, everything went blank. The next thing she knew, she was waking up, naked, in a room, with her boyfriend and several of his friends. They were naked too. She had no memory of how she got there, no memory of what happened, no memory of the hours in between. As she spoke, her voice cracked repeatedly. She seemed unable to process what she was describing. Honestly, I don't think I processed it either. At 16 years old, I didn't have the emotional maturity or life experience to fully understand the gravity of what I was hearing. I knew it was terrible. I knew something awful had happened. But I couldn't comprehend the full weight of it. Today, as an adult, I understand it differently. At the time, I simply focused on getting her home safely. The drive back felt endless. Neither of us said much. Every now and then, she would start crying again. Sometimes, she would stare silently out the window. I didn't know what to say. There are moments in life when words simply don't exist. This was one of them. Eventually, we reached her house. She thanked me quietly. Then she got out of the car. I watched her walk toward the house before driving away. That was it. No dramatic ending, no confrontation, no police lights, no justice. Just silence. I returned home sometime around dawn. I snuck back into my house the same way I had left. A couple of hours later, my alarm went off for school. I remember sitting in class that day feeling exhausted and disconnected from everything around me. People talked about homework, sports, and weekend plans. Meanwhile, all I could think about was the terrified girl sitting in my passenger seat a few hours earlier. Strangely, we never discussed it again. Not once. She never brought it up. Neither did I. At the time, that seemed normal somehow. People often assume traumatic events come with dramatic conversations and emotional closure. The truth is often much messier. Sometimes people survive something terrible and simply keep moving. Not because they're okay, because they don't know how else to continue. Life went on. We graduated. Our paths slowly separated. Years passed. Then more years. Eventually, she got married. From what I can see, she built a life for herself. She has children now, a family, a husband who appears to be a good man. On the surface, she seems happy. We don't really talk anymore. Life took us in different directions. But every now and then, I'll look at her social media profile. Not because I'm holding on to old feelings, not because I expect to reconnect. I think I do it because a part of me still remembers that winter night. A part of me still remembers the fear in her voice, the way she climbed into my car, the way she stared out the window in silence. Back then, I didn't fully understand what I was witnessing. Now I do, or at least I understand enough. The older I get, the harder this story becomes to tell, especially after becoming a parent. When you're young, tragedy often feels abstract. You recognize pain, but you don't truly grasp its depth. Then you have children. Everything changes. I have kids of my own now. I have a daughter who means more to me than I could ever put into words. The thought of her experiencing something similar is almost unbearable. And suddenly, memories that once felt distant become incredibly personal. When I think back to that night now, I don't see it through the eyes of a 16-year-old boy anymore. I see it through the eyes of a father. I think about how scared that girl must have been, how alone she must have felt, how much courage it must have taken to make that phone call. Out of everyone she could have called, she called me. Not because I was brave, not because I had answers, simply because she trusted me. And all these years later, that's the part that stays with me. I couldn't fix what happened. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't give her justice or erase her pain. The only thing I could do was answer the phone and show up. Sometimes I wonder if she remembers that night at all. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about it. Maybe she does. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe she's found peace. I hope she has. More than anything, I hope she's happy. I hope she feels safe. I hope she's surrounded by people who genuinely love and respect her. And whenever I see a new family photo appear online, whenever I see her smiling beside her children, I quietly hope that whatever darkness existed in her life back then stayed in the past where it belongs. Because some memories never really leave us, but sometimes, despite them, people still manage to build beautiful lives. And I hope that's exactly what she did.